Welcome to the Colleague Experience podcast. In this episode, we delve into bold insights, experimentation, and groundbreaking leadership strategies. Today, we're exploring the dynamic world of boundary management in organizations where flexibility and adaptability can transform roles and responsibilities into collaborative powerhouses. Let's dive in. There are moments in the year when something in the landscape, in the light or in the air, suddenly brings us back to thoughts about boundaries. It might be a seasonal flower that appears without warning, or just a feeling of transition between periods. Take the desert squill, for example. It's always amazing to see how at the height of the dry season, even before a single rain shower moistens the ground, it emerges and grows and blooms, as if challenging the conventions of nature. In school, they explain to us that it sends down such deep roots and is so hard to uproot that it serves to mark boundaries between territories. Kinda strange, isn't it? How a plant that's invisible above ground most of the year can serve as a boundary marker. When they said the same thing about the prickly pear cactus, it sounded more believable. You can see how the large, thorny cactus that doesn't disappear for more than 10 months of the year could be a border guard. On the other hand, who said boundaries always need guarding? Boundaries. In the organizational world, the word boundary usually serves in the meaning of border, a line that must not be crossed. One of the classic organizational metaphors is the boundary between the areas of responsibility and roles of different people or departments. You know that situation where someone enters a new position and is supposed to inherit an area of responsibility from someone else. But the previous person doesn't really leave. They continue to interfere, to decide, to get into the details. And the feeling. Stepping on toes. In other words, there's a boundary between them and it's been crossed. Classical management, which is very troubled by the situation where things fall between the cracks, but also very anxious about stepping on toes, is very busy with questions of roles and responsibilities, definitions of areas of responsibility, raci matrices, and other concepts and techniques from this genre. We think it's generally positive that people know what their area of responsibility is, know what is and isn't expected of them, and that they define clear interfaces as much as possible with their partners in getting things done. Where does the problem begin? The problem is that behind the discussions about defining areas of responsibility stands a wish, not to say fantasy, that the areas of responsibility that will be defined will be fixed and clear from now until further notice. If you will, that it will be possible to plant desert squills between them, or prickly pears, depending on your style. Where does this aspiration come from? Sometimes it's related to the wish that the system will work like a well-oiled machine, that you can define once how it should work, and it will already know how to replicate that without interruption. We've already dealt with this metaphor fantasy here before. Sometimes it's related to our desire to ensure that no one steps on our toes. In this sense, a racy discussion is the human equivalent of the habit of dogs and other animals to urinate around their territory. And sometimes it belongs to the realms of difficulty with changes and moving the cheese, so it's no wonder that in many cases the organizing metaphor for relationships between different people and organizational units is boundary. What comes to mind when we think of boundary? Boundary is a concept we know well from the political world. What separates between countries is a border. How do you move a border? Usually through war. And whoever crosses the border often finds themselves beyond enemy lines. State borders are also connected to the identity and history of the state, so countries will be willing to fight and pay a high price to keep their borders in place. Many times when we talk about boundaries in organizational situations, we load these meanings into the content. In parentheses, let's say it might have been good if we had found a Hebrew alternative to the word boundary that isn't border. In English, border and boundary have somewhat different meanings. Border is used mainly in the sense of clear separation between very distinct elements. while boundary refers to a division that can't necessarily be marked with clear lines, close parentheses. When talking about organizations, boundaries don't need to be defended. Boundaries need to be managed. Organizational boundaries aren't meant to separate. They're meant to facilitate and make work more efficient, but they can't be static. On the contrary, they must be dynamic and move all the time according to different needs and situations. It's possible and also important to define them, but not as a one-time event, rather as something that requires ongoing dialogue and updating. When someone steps on your toes, they're not necessarily starting a war to change the location of the boundary. It could be that the original definition of territorial boundaries doesn't suit them in the current situation. Before you mobilize the reserves to defend the boundaries, you can talk. You can understand why the other side thinks there's room for different conduct than what was defined. For this to succeed, there needs to be a way to talk about these issues. Therefore, when defining territorial boundaries, interfaces, or processes, it's no less important, in the same breath, to define how to manage the movement of the boundary so that it will be flexible enough and won't lead to unnecessary battles and wars. Let us share two examples from our consulting work that illustrate this dynamic approach to boundaries. We worked with a large media agency where the creative team and the account management team were constantly at odds. The initial boundary definition was clear. Creatives develop concepts and campaigns. Account managers handle client relationships and execution. But in practice, clients would call creatives directly with feedback, and account managers would make creative suggestions during presentations. Instead of defending these rigid boundaries, we helped them establish regular boundary check meetings. They created a simple process where either team could propose boundary adjustments based on specific client needs or project requirements. The result was much smoother collaboration and better client outcomes, because the boundary could flex when a particular client preferred direct creative contact, or when an account manager had valuable creative insights. In another case, we worked with a traditional manufacturing company where the engineering and production departments had well-established territorial boundaries. Engineers designed products and handed them off to production, who manufactured them according to specifications. But when the company started developing more complex products with shorter development cycles, this rigid handoff was creating delays and quality issues. Production workers often had insights that could improve the design, but there was no mechanism for this feedback to reach engineering during the design phase. Rather than maintaining the traditional boundary, we helped them create flexible collaboration zones where engineers and production staff could work together during critical design phases. They established criteria for when to activate these collaborative periods and how to manage the temporary boundary shifts. This led to better products, faster development times, and higher job satisfaction for both teams. The key insight from both examples is that boundaries serve the work, not the other way around. When we treat boundaries like territorial borders that must be defended at all costs, we often end up fighting the wrong battles. When we treat them as tools that can be adjusted to serve the organization's goals, we create more effective and more satisfying ways of working together. This doesn't mean boundaries should be completely fluid or undefined. Clear boundaries provide important structure and clarity, but they should be living agreements that can evolve as circumstances change, rather than fixed walls that people either respect or violate. The most successful organizations we've worked with don't just define boundaries once during an organizational design process. They build ongoing conversations about boundaries into their regular operations. They create forums where people can raise questions about whether current boundaries are serving the work effectively. They develop criteria for when boundary adjustments might be needed and processes for making those adjustments collaboratively. This approach requires a fundamental shift in how we think about organizational structure. Instead of seeing boundaries as permanent features of the organizational landscape, We need to see them as agreements between people that can and should be revisited as the work evolves. It also requires different skills from leaders and team members. Instead of just knowing how to defend your territory, you need to know how to have productive conversations about whether the current territorial arrangements are working. Instead of seeing boundary crossing as necessarily problematic, you need to be able to distinguish between helpful boundary flexibility and genuinely problematic boundary violations. This shift isn't always easy, especially for people who have spent their careers in more traditional organizational structures. But the alternative, defending static boundaries in an increasingly dynamic world, leads to organizational rigidity and conflict that serves no one well. The desert squill teaches us something important here. It thrives not because it has permanent above-ground presence, but because it has deep, flexible root systems that allow it to emerge when conditions are right. Perhaps our organizational boundaries should be more like this, grounded in deep shared understanding of purpose and values, but flexible enough to emerge in different configurations as circumstances change. And that's the end of today's podcast. We've explored how viewing boundaries as evolving agreements can foster collaboration and improve outcomes in organizations, just like the desert squill reminds us of nature's unseen boundaries. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends and colleagues so they can also stay updated on the latest news and gain powerful insights. Stay tuned for more updates.